I was 9 years old the first time I saw him, the man with no hair, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, no stubble on his chin. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his expression was disturbingly blank. But the worst part, he was staring right at me. I had always been a sleepwalker, my parents told me. They'd often find me wandering the halls at night, muttering nonsense, my eyes half-lidded but eerily open. That night was no different, or so I thought. I woke up standing in front of my bedroom window, my fingers pressed against the cold glass. The street was empty, the world was quiet, and then I saw him. He stood on the sidewalk just beyond the dim glow of the street lamp, his face tilted upward. He wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, just watching. A chill spread through me, but I couldn't look away. Something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong there, like he didn't belong anywhere. My breath caught in my throat as his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he was studying me. I don't know why, but a deep, primal fear rooted me to the spot. Then his body jerked, not a step forward, more like a twitch, a glitch in movement, unnatural and jarring. My stomach twisted. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped somewhere in my chest. His mouth opened slightly, lips parting just enough to reveal a glimpse of teeth. Teeth that looked too even, too perfect. Then, in one unnatural motion, he bolted, not away, not toward me, but in a bizarre zigzag pattern, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. His movements were too fast, too erratic, like something mimicking a human but getting it wrong. My scream finally broke free, shattering the silence of the night. In an instant, my father burst into my room, his face wild with concern. I spun toward him, pointing at the window, my voice shrill and frantic. There was a man right there. He was staring at me. By the time my dad reached the window, the street was empty again. The wind rustled through the trees, the world still and undisturbed. He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "You were sleepwalking again," he muttered, pulling me away from the window. "Just a bad dream." But I knew what I saw. The next morning, my parents found something that made their faces go pale. Scratches on the front door, long, jagged. Scrapes like fingernails had raked against the wood, trying to find a way inside. They changed the locks that afternoon, but I never told them the worst part. Because that night, before my father had turned me away from the window, I had seen something else. Just before the hairless man disappeared, he had moved his hand, raising it ever so slightly, not in a wave, not in a threat, but in a beckoning gesture, as if he had been waiting for me to come outside. It was supposed to be a simple trip. 3 days in Prague, exploring the old streets, drinking cheap beer, and getting lost in the city's eerie charm. My boyfriend and I had been planning it for months, eager to soak in the history and maybe even visit a few haunted places for fun. But what happened on that trip has haunted me ever since. On our second day, we joined a guided tour through the city's historic district. That's where we met another couple, Matthias and Sophie, a friendly German pair who were traveling through Europe. We clicked instantly, spending the afternoon together, laughing over local ghost stories and exchanging travel plans. By the time we reached Petrin Tower, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The tour guide encouraged us to climb to the top for a breathtaking view of the city. Matthias, however, waved us off with a chuckle. "I'll stay down here and watch the bags," he said, gesturing to their backpacks. "You go enjoy the view." Sophie hesitated, but after a bit of coaxing, she followed us up the winding staircase. The climb was exhausting, but the view was worth it. Prague stretched out beneath us like a Gothic painting, its rooftops bathed in gold and crimson hues. We took pictures, pointed out landmarks, and lost track of time. When we finally descended, the square was darker, quieter. But something was wrong. Matthias was gone. His seat was empty, their bags untouched beside the bench where he had been sitting. Sophie frowned, calling his name, scanning the crowd, but there was no sign of him. At first we thought he had just wandered off, maybe to grab a drink or use the restroom. But minutes passed, then half an hour, then an hour. Panic settled into Sophie's face. "He wouldn't just leave," she whispered. We searched everywhere, the nearby streets, the alleys, the tram stops. We asked passers-by, but no one had seen a tall German man sitting alone on that bench. He had vanished, as if he had never been there to begin with. The police were called, reports were filed, but Matthias never reappeared. Days later, after we had returned home, I couldn't shake the unease that followed me. Then one night, while mindlessly scrolling the internet, I stumbled upon an old forum thread discussing Prague's dark past. In the 1990s, the city had been a notorious hub for human trafficking. Hundreds of people had disappeared, many of them tourists, their cases left unsolved. Some were snatched from bars, others from alleyways, and some, according to urban legend, had vanished from crowded public spaces as if they had been plucked out of existence. A cold dread settled over me. Matthias wasn't just missing, he had been taken, and the worst part, no one ever saw him again. When we first moved to Windfall, Indiana, I remember feeling an unease I couldn't explain. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, yet it felt off. The air seemed heavier, the streets quieter than they should be. My parents, excited about the fresh start, brushed off my concerns. But from the very first night in that house, I knew something was wrong. It started with the boy. I saw him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, just a shadowed figure, barely visible in the dim glow of the nightlight. At first, I thought it was my brother, but when I called his name, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, watching. A wave of cold dread settled in my chest. I blinked, and he was gone. I didn't tell anyone at first. I convinced myself I was imagining things, but then the noises started. At night, cabinets would slam shut in the kitchen. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, even when no one was awake. My mother found the dining room chairs, pulled away from the table every morning, arranged in odd patterns. She tried to laugh it off, but I could see the fear behind her eyes. One evening, I was playing in the backyard when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned toward the house, and there, standing in the upstairs window, was the boy, dark silhouette, unmoving, his face just an empty void. My stomach dropped. I ran inside, calling for my mom. "There's someone upstairs!" I cried, my voice shaking. My mom and dad rushed up the stairs, searching every room. Nothing, no open windows, no signs of entry, just an empty, silent house. That was the night my mom finally admitted it. "You've seen the boy, haven't you?" she whispered. Froze. She had seen him too. For years, I thought the boy was the only thing haunting that house. But I was wrong, because one night as I lay in bed, I felt a shift in the air. The darkness in the corner of my room seemed deeper, heavier. My breath hitched as a new shape emerged, a taller, shadowy figure standing behind the boy. And then, for the first time, I saw him move. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking up at whatever stood behind him, and he was terrified. I was 8 the first time I noticed it. A green car, an old model, the paint slightly faded but unmistakably vibrant against the dull grey of the streets. At first I thought nothing of it, just another vehicle on my usual route to school. But then I started seeing it everywhere. It would be parked across from my house in the mornings. I'd spot it trailing behind me as I walked down the sidewalk, only a few car lengths away. Sometimes I'd glance out of my classroom window and there it was, idling at the corner of the street. I never saw the driver. The windows were tinted just enough to hide whoever was inside, but I could feel them watching me. One morning, as I stepped onto the sidewalk, the car crept forward, moving at an agonizingly slow pace. My stomach twisted. I picked up my speed. So did the car. I turned a corner. It followed. Panic clawed up my throat. I didn't know what to do. I was just a kid. I didn't have a phone. I didn't know if I was imagining things or if this was real-life horror unfolding before me. Then just as I reached the edge of my neighborhood, a voice called out, "Sweetheart, are you lost?" I turned to see an elderly woman standing on her front porch, her brow furrowed with concern. Without thinking, I ran toward her. I didn't look back at the car. I didn't want to. She ushered me inside, locking the door behind us. "Someone following you?" she asked gently. I nodded, too shaken to speak. Peeking through the curtains, I saw the green car hesitate at the intersection. Then, as if realizing I was no longer alone, it drove off. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Years later, long after I had moved away, I stumbled upon a true crime article. A woman arrested for multiple kidnappings and murders. Her signature? A green car. My blood ran cold. The police believed she had been active for over a decade, always targeting young children, always waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I still wonder what would have happened if that woman hadn't called out to me that day. I still wonder how close I had come to never coming home. The basement was cold, not just the kind of cold that made you pull the blankets tighter, but a deep, unnatural chill that settled into your bones. I had never liked sleeping down there, but it was the only available room in the cabin we had, rented for the weekend. My friends were all upstairs, warm and safe. I was alone in the dark. At first it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. The wind outside rattled the windows. The floorboards above me moaned under shifting weight. Normal, harmless. I kept my eyes shut, willing myself to sleep. Then I heard it, a whisper, low, rasping, just above my ear. "You're evil." My entire body locked up. My breath hitched in my throat, my fingers gripping the blanket so hard, my knuckles turned white. I told myself I was imagining it, just the wind, just a bad dream. But then it came again. "You're evil." The voice was dry, like paper, tearing, hollow and emotionless. It was so close, I could feel the warmth of breath against my skin. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The basement was empty. The door was still shut. The only light came from the dim glow of my phone screen. But I wasn't alone. The air felt different, charged, heavy. My eyes darted to the far corner of the room, where the darkness seemed thicker. And then I saw it. A shape, a figure hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. I couldn't see its face, just the vague outline of a body shifting in the shadows. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whisper came again, a chorus now, as if many voices were speaking at once. "You're evil, you're evil, you're evil." I don't remember falling asleep. I don't remember anything after that. When my friends shook me awake, the next morning I was still curled in the same spot, my body frozen in fear. They laughed when I told them what had happened, but I knew the truth, because when I finally worked up the courage to check the mirror that morning, I saw it, a single blackened handprint on my shoulder. I met Lucy when I was 7. She was the kind of friend who made everything feel like an adventure, always pushing boundaries, always testing limits. At first I adored her. She was bold, fearless, the kind of girl who never hesitated. But there was something off about her, something I didn't understand back then. It started small. She would lie effortlessly, weaving stories that made no sense, but she always told them with such confidence that you almost believed her. She'd break my toys and laugh when I got upset. Once, she locked me in my closet for hours, giggling from the other side of the door while I pounded and screamed. But the worst thing she ever did was at the lake. We were 9, playing near the edge of the water, skipping rocks, when she turned to me with that familiar grin, the one that always meant trouble. "Let's go in deeper," she said. "It's more fun out there." I hesitated. The lake had always scared me a little. The water was dark, the bottom unseen, the kind of place where things lurked just out of sight. But Lucy was already wading, in, her arms stretched out. "Come on," she called. "Don't be a baby." So I followed. We moved further and further until I couldn't touch the bottom anymore. My heartbeat quickened. The shore looked so far away. "Lucy," I said, "I think we should go back." She didn't answer. Instead, she swam behind me, pressing her hands against my shoulders. Then she pushed me under. At first, I thought it was a joke, but she didn't let go. The water rushed into my nose, burning my lungs as I thrashed. I kicked, clawed at her arms, but she was stronger than I expected. The panic set in, a deep, primal terror. I was drowning. Just as my vision began to blur, her grip loosened. I shot to the surface, coughing, gasping, my chest burning. Lucy just floated there, watching me, not laughing, not apologizing, just watching. We never spoke about it. I never told anyone. But I never swam with her again. Years later, long after we had drifted apart, my mother told me something that made my blood turn to ice. "Before you were born," she said softly, "I had another daughter." I stared at her, my throat dry. "We lost her," she whispered. "But we had a name picked out for her. I didn't want to ask. I didn't want to know, but the question slipped out anyway." "What was it?" She exhaled, her eyes distant. "Lucy." When I was 5, I had an imaginary friend named Don. He wasn't like the other imaginary friends kids usually have. He didn't have wings or magic powers, and he never wanted to play games. Don just talked. I don't remember when he first appeared. He was just there, sitting in the old rocking chair in my bedroom, smiling at me like we had always known each other. He looked old, with greyish skin and sunken eyes, but his voice was warm and kind. He told me stories about the house, about the people who used to live in it. I never thought to question how he knew so much. My parents found it cute at first. A child's imagination, they said. They would hear me chatting away at night, my small voice carrying through the baby monitor. "Who are you talking to?" my mum would ask in the morning. "Don," I'd reply. "He lives here." But then, strange things started happening. My toys would move on their own. Doors would creak open in the middle of the night. Once, my mum swore she heard footsteps pacing outside my room, but when she checked, no one was there. The worst was when I woke up crying one night, clutching my chest. "Don says something bad is coming," I sobbed. "He says we should leave." My parents started getting nervous. My dad even went so far as to Google the house's history. He expected to find nothing, but what he did find made him turn pale. To say previous owner had died inside the house. A man in his 70s. His name, Don. The rocking chair in my bedroom had belonged to him. After that, my parents did everything they could to keep me from talking to Don. They took the chair out of my room, left lights on at night, even brought in a priest to bless the house. Eventually I stopped mentioning him, but I never told them the truth, because the night after they took the chair away, I heard him one last time, his voice right next to my ear. "I told you something bad was coming." We moved out 2 months later. The next family that bought the house, their son had an imaginary friend too. His name was Don. My grandfather was a strong man, the kind who never showed fear, never flinched, never spoke about things he couldn't explain. But there was one night, one single night, that changed him forever, and whatever happened out there, he took it to his grave. I was young, maybe 8 or 9, when I first heard the story from my mother. She never gave many details, just whispered fragments late at night when she thought I was asleep. "He was never the same after that night," she murmured once. "It was like something broke inside him. It happened before I was born, when my grandfather was in his 30s. He had been out late, working on something in the barn, when he came stumbling back to the house. Not walking, running. My grandmother, startled awake, barely had time to react before he slammed the door behind him, locked it, and bolted every window. He was shaking, pale, sweating. She asked him what happened. He wouldn't say. He just kept pacing, his hands gripping his hair, muttering under his breath. Then he grabbed a knife from the kitchen and sat by the front door, refusing to sleep. The next morning, my grandmother found him exactly where she had left him. Knife still in hand, eyes bloodshot, staring at the door like he expected something to burst through at any second. He never told anyone what he saw, but after that night he changed. He stopped going out after dark, stopped working in the barn alone. He replaced every lock in the house, added extra bolts to the doors. Once, my mother asked him directly, "What happened that night?" He just shook his head. "It doesn't matter," he said. "It didn't get me. That should have been the end of it." But years later, after my grandfather passed away, I was helping my family clean out his things. In the attic, buried beneath old papers and rusted tools, I found a wooden box. Inside were newspaper clippings, dozens of them, all about missing people, and all of them disappeared on the same night he came home terrified. The dates matched, the locations matched, and at the bottom of the box, tucked beneath the clippings, was a single note in his shaky handwriting. I saw it. I saw what took them, and I think it saw me too. I was 16 when I first saw her. It was late, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning, and I had gone downstairs to grab a drink of water. The house was silent, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. As I walked past the dining room, I glanced toward the large wooden table and froze. There, sitting in one of the chairs, was a girl I had never seen before. She was young, around my age, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. But what disturbed me the most was the black cat curled in her lap, its yellow eyes gleaming in the dim light. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My heart slammed against my ribs, my skin prickling with a cold, crawling sensation. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The chair was empty. The room was normal again. It was as if she had never been there at all. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a half-dream born from exhaustion. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Years passed. I never saw her again. I moved out, started a life of my own, and eventually had a daughter. Then one evening I was cooking dinner when I heard my little girl giggling in the next room. I smiled, assuming she was playing with her toys. But when I turned the corner, my breath caught in my throat. She was sitting at the dining room table, completely still, and in her lap, stroking a black cat that wasn't ours, was the girl from my past. She looked exactly the same, not older, not different, as if time had never touched her. For a moment, our eyes met. Then, just like before, she vanished. I rushed to my daughter, pulling her into my arms. "Who are you talking to?" I asked, my voice unsteady. She smiled up at me innocently. "My friend," she said. "She comes to visit sometimes." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What's her name?" She tilted her head, as if confused. "By the question, she doesn't have one," she said, "but she told me she used to live here." It started with a gesture. At first, we thought it was just a silly thing kids do. Our son, barely 4 years old, would drag his tiny finger across his throat, slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on us with unsettling intensity. The first time he did it, my husband laughed. "Where'd you learn that, buddy?" he asked. But our son didn't answer. He just smiled. At dinner, he'd do it again. In the car, in the middle of bedtime stories. Always the same slow, deliberate motion. "What does that mean, sweetheart?" I asked one night, trying to keep my voice light. His little face darkened, his brows furrowing in thought. Then, in the softest whisper, he said, "It means they're coming." A shiver crawled down my spine. "Who's coming?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked away. The nightmares started soon after. My husband and I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, always with the same horrible feeling, like someone had been in the room with us. But when we turned on the lights, the house was silent. Then the strange occurrences began. Objects moved from their places. The TV flicked on in the middle of the night, static, buzzing in the darkness. The baby monitor would pick up soft, rhythmic breathing, except it wasn't coming from our son's room. One night I woke to the feeling of pressure on my chest, like something heavy was sitting on me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. In the darkness I heard a faint, raspy whisper. "They're already here," I shot up, gasping for air, my hands clawing at my throat. My husband stirred beside me, groggy. "Bad dream?" he mumbled, but you barely heard him, because standing in the doorway, bathed in the soft glow of the hallway light, was our son. His finger was across his throat again, and this time he wasn't smiling.